The highways of Florida carried more than travelers. They carried secrets. Beyond the highways were back roads, quiet, forgotten, and waiting. Here, a figure emerged, weathered, restless, always watching the road. A drifter, a survivalist, a woman whose story unsettled an entire state. She walked the margins of society, carrying a story that few understood. Soon, unexplained discoveries began to appear along these roads. Cars left behind, belongings scattered. Investigators searched for patterns, piecing together fragments of a growing mystery. Headlines soon spread. Whispers turned into front-page stories. From living rooms to newsrooms, the story gripped the nation. But behind the headlines was a woman, hardened, restless, and marked by survival. Her choices and her life left behind questions that still echo today. Between 1989 and 1990, Florida was gripped by a mystery that seemed impossible to explain. Bodies began turning up along highways, abandoned cars, missing wallets, gunshot wounds. At first, detectives wondered, were these robberies gone wrong? Random violence? Or something more chilling? The trail of evidence suggested a single hand behind the deaths. But who would suspect her? A woman, a hitchhiker, targeting men along the highways of America's vacation capital? Aileen Wuornos became one of the most feared female criminals in American history. A drifter, a survivalist, and, as prosecutors would claim, a woman who turned the open road into her hunting ground. But here's the question I want you to ask yourself as you listen to this story. Was Aileen simply a predator, cold, calculated, and remorseless? Or was she, as she would later insist, a victim herself, a woman pushed so far by abuse, exploitation, and betrayal that she struck back at the very world that crushed her? Because if there's one thing certain about the case of Aileen Wuornos, it's this: nothing is simple, and nothing is what it seems. Over the next minute, we'll unravel her story piece by piece. From a childhood of abandonment and cruelty, to a drifting life on the margins of society, to the love affair that gave her purpose, and finally, to the string of killings that would make her infamous across the world. But let me ask you this. When you hear the name Aileen Wuornos, what image comes to mind? Do you see a monster, a merciless killer who lured men to their deaths? Or do you see a broken woman, chewed up by poverty and abuse, striking out in rage and fear? As the highways stretched on in Florida, each mile brought new victims. And with every body left behind, investigators inched closer to uncovering the truth. But when they finally unmasked the killer, what shocked the world wasn't just what she had done, but who she was. Because behind the headlines, behind the courtroom drama, behind the mugshots that circulated in every newspaper, was a woman with a story so tragic, so twisted, that even now, decades later, we're left with a haunting question. Was she born evil or made that way? Her life didn't begin on the highways of Florida. It began far from there, in a small Michigan town, where a baby girl was brought into the world already surrounded by chaos. A father in prison, a mother who disappeared, and a childhood marked not by love and safety, but by abandonment, anger, and survival. So before we dive into the murders, we must go back to the beginning. Because to understand how Aileen Wuornos became the woman who terrified Florida's highways, we first need to understand the little girl who never truly had a chance. Every story has a beginning, and for Aileen Wuornos, that beginning was anything but ordinary. If the Florida highways would later become the stage of her crimes, the backdrop of her childhood was a different kind of darkness, one that shaped the woman she would become. She was born in February of 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her mother, Diane, was only a teenager when Aileen and her brother Keith were born. Their father, he was already behind bars, a convicted criminal with a record of violence. He was absent from the very first day. Now pause for a moment. Imagine being brought into this world, and from the start, the foundation you're supposed to stand on, love, safety, family, is cracked. No father, a mother too young, and overwhelmed to provide stability. So what chance did Aileen really have? By the time Aileen was just a toddler, her mother walked away. She left Aileen and Keith in the care of their grandparents, Lori and Britta. But rather than stability, the children found more turbulence. Eileen's grandmother struggled with health issues. Her grandfather, according to many accounts, had a temper that made the household tense and frightening. Now, I want you to picture this. A young girl, barely old enough to tie her shoes, already learning that the people she depended on most would disappear, or worse, turn against her. Can you imagine what kind of lessons that teaches a child about trust, about love, about survival? By the time Aileen reached grade school, her world was already marked by chaos. She was often teased by other kids for her appearance, for her poverty, for simply being different. She didn't have the comfort of a stable home to return to after those long days at school. Instead, she grew tougher, harder, more independent. She developed the kind of edge you only get when you realize early on that no one is coming to save you. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because survival, when learned at such a young age, doesn't just make you strong, it can also make you cold. It teaches you to rely only on yourself, to see the world as hostile. And if the world is hostile, doesn't that justify hostility in return? Neighbors later remembered Aileen as a child who often seemed angry, volatile, and desperate for attention. She experimented with risky behavior at an age when most kids were still playing tag. Some might call this acting out. But ask yourself, was she acting out, or was she simply echoing the instability she had been handed? Every warning sign was there. A child adrift, unloved, craving stability but never receiving it. And when those needs aren't met, the consequences don't just vanish. They grow. By her teenage years, Aileen was completely on her own. She was forced to leave her home, cast out into the world with no money, no support, and no clear path forward. Think about that for a moment. 15 years old, with nothing, no family to lean on, no roof over her head, just the cold reality of survival. How far would you go if you were that desperate? What decisions would you make if the alternative was hunger or freezing under the stars? For Aileen, survival meant living by her own rules. She began hitchhiking across Michigan, trading small favors for food, shelter, or a ride to the next town. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define her adult life. Relying on strangers, drifting from place to place, never settling, never belonging. And beneath it all, resentment festered. The little girl abandoned in Michigan grew into a teenager, convinced that the world had already betrayed her. So why, she thought, should she play by its rules? Now, here's where I want you to pause. Because it's easy with the benefit of hindsight to say, well, lots of people grow up in hard circumstances. Not everyone turns violent. And that's true. But let me ask you, what if you took a child who had never truly known love, who had been pushed out her home, who learned that trust only leads to pain, and then you threw her into adulthood with no safety net? Would that child grow into a well-adjusted adult? Or would she become something else entirely? Someone who saw the world not as a place of opportunity, but as a battlefield. By the time she was barely out of her teens, Aileen had already been arrested for minor offenses. She lived on fringes, panhandling, stealing, drifting. She bounced from state to state, each stop leaving her more hardened than the last. But Michigan wasn't big enough to hold her story. She was chasing warmer skies, chasing the next escape, the next promise of something better. Her drifting eventually carried her all the way down to Florida. And Florida, well, Florida was where her name would be written into the darkest chapters of true crime history. Because once Aileen Wuornos hit the highways of the Sunshine State, the world around her had no idea what was coming. And neither did she. Florida in the late 1970s was a place of contrasts. Sun-soaked beaches, booming tourism, endless highways lined with palm trees. To the world, it was paradise. But to Aileen Wuornos, it was survival. By the time she reached the Sunshine State, she was no longer a child. She was a hardened young woman, scarred by abandonment, fueled by anger, and driven by a single mission: to make it through another day. But here's the thing about survival. It doesn't leave much room for morals, for love, for rules. When your life is reduced to the basics, food, shelter, protection, Everything else fades away. And Aileen lived in that stripped-down world where desperation and danger dance together on a razor's edge. She became a familiar sight on Florida's roads. Hitchhiking, drifting, living out of motels, sometimes sleeping under the stars. To some, she looked like just another traveler. To others, she was a warning sign, rough, unpredictable, with eyes that told stories no one dared ask about. Imagine the Florida highways at night. Neon signs buzzing outside roadside bars. The hum of 18-wheelers roaring past. And on the shoulder, Aileen, thumb extended, waiting for someone to stop. Would you have picked her up? Would you have rolled down your window for a stranger whose life story was written in scars and secrets? Aileen's drifting life came with consequences. She was arrested multiple times for theft, for altercations, for carrying weapons. Each charge added another layer to her reputation. But notice the pattern. These weren't the crimes of someone chasing thrills. These were the acts of someone barely clinging to survival, taking what she could, fighting when cornered, always moving, always looking over her shoulder. Ask yourself, was she already on the path toward violence? Or was she just trying to survive in a world that had never once given her a fair chance? In the bars and biker hangouts of Florida, Aileen became known. She had a sharp tongue, a fiery temper, and a willingness to scrap with anyone who crossed her. To some, she was dangerous. To others, just another drifter blending into the chaos of roadside America. But beneath that rough exterior was something else, a woman who still longed for connection, for love, for someone to stay when everyone else had left. And that longing would soon lead her into the arms of the one person who would change everything, Tyria Moore. It was 1986 when Aileen met Tyria in a Daytona Beach bar. Tyria was a hotel maid, quiet, reserved, the opposite of Aileen in almost every way. But for Aileen, that contrast was magnetic. For the first time in her life, she had someone who listened, someone who stayed, someone who didn't vanish when things got hard. Think about it. After a lifetime of abandonment, of betrayal, what does it do to someone when they finally feel seen? For Aileen, it meant everything. But love, for her, was never simple. Love didn't erase the survival instinct. It only added another mouth to feed, another pressure bear. And soon, the line between devotion and desperation would begin to blur. Aileen and Tyria moved in together, living hand to mouth. Their income came from Aileen's encounters on the highways, from hustling in bars, from scraping by however they could. But love, even desperate love, comes with expectations. Bills had to be paid. Rent had to be met. And Tyria, while not directly involved in Aileen's work, relied on her to keep their world afloat. Here's the chilling question. What happens when survival isn't just about yourself anymore, but about the one person you love most? What would you do to keep them from walking away? By the late 1980s, Aileen was at a crossroads. On one side, the life of a drifter she had always known, unstable, dangerous, but familiar. On the other side, the promise of something resembling stability with Tyria, but stability required money, and money was always scarce. The more Aileen struggled, the more pressure mounted. And then something shifted. Aileen later claimed that her encounters on the highways weren't just business. They were dangerous. She said she was threatened, attacked, pushed beyond her breaking point. And that's when the first death occurred. Now here's where the story twists. Was it self-defense, as Aileen insisted? Or was it the beginning of something darker, a pattern that would leave bodies scattered along Florida's roads? Only she knew the truth. And that truth was about to change Florida forever. So let me ask you directly. When you look at Aileen at this stage of her life, what do you see? Do you see a woman hardened by poverty and abuse, pushed into situations that no one should have to face? Or do you see the early signs of a predator, someone who had grown comfortable with taking, with lying, with violence when it suited her? This is the razor's edge we walk with her story. Victim or villain, survivor or predator. Because on the highways of Florida, that line was about to disappear. And with it, the lives of men who thought they were simply offering a ride. The year was 1989. Aileen was drifting, struggling, clinging to her relationship with Tyria like a lifeline. And then came Richard Mallory, the first man whose encounter with Aileen would make headlines across the nation. But was Mallory simply an unlucky stranger, or the spark that lit the fuse of America's most infamous female serial case? Stay with me, because once this first body was discovered, Florida would never feel safe again. It started with a single ride, a simple encounter on a lonely stretch of Florida highway. No one could have known that what began as a moment of chance would open the door to one of the most haunting crime stories in American history. The man who pulled over that day thought he was offering a ride to a drifter. He thought it would be nothing more than a brief encounter, but by the end of it, he would never see home again. And Florida, the land of sun, beaches, and endless highways, would become a hunting ground where fear behind every mile marker. His name was Richard Mallory, a man with his own complicated history. He was driving alone when he stopped to pick up Aileen. To him, she was just a hitchhiker. To her, he was something more. Later, Aileen would claim the encounter turned violent, that she was forced to defend herself. Investigators, however, weren't convinced. The truth of what happened in that car remains clouded in mystery, even now. But what we do know is this: Mallory never made a home. His disappearance would be the first ripple in what soon became a storm. At first, Mallory's case didn't make national news. Florida highways had always carried danger. A missing man was tragic, but not unprecedented. But then another man vanished, and another within months. Bodies were turning up off rural roads, all with chillingly similar circumstances. Men traveling alone, men last seen on the highways, men who had offered a ride and never returned. What are the odds of so many similar disappearances in such a short time? Coincidence? Or was someone stalking the roads, turning chance encounters into deadly traps? Florida in the late 1980s was no longer just a tourist paradise. Truckers whispered warnings at diners. Families locked their doors earlier, and men traveling alone began to second-guess the simple act of stopping for a hitchhiker. Imagine driving down a dark stretch of I-75 at night. The road is empty. The hum of your engine, the only sound. Then up ahead, you see a woman with her thumb out, standing under a flickering streetlight. Would you stop, or would you press the gas a little harder, hoping not to make eye contact? That was the atmosphere in Florida. Every empty stretch of road carried the weight of suspicion. Every encounter could be the last. Through it all, Aileen wasn't alone. She was still living with Tyria, still clinging to the only stability she had ever known. Some claim Tyria suspected what was happening. Others say she was completely in the dark, believing Aileen's late nights and sudden bursts of money were just the chaos of her lifestyle. But here's the question: how much did Tyria know? Was she truly innocent? Or did love blind her to the warning signs that something much darker was taking place? As the bodies piled up, investigators began connecting the dots. The victims had eerie similarities. They were found near highways, their vehicles often missing, and personal items scattered or stolen. It wasn't just random. There was a pattern, and detectives, frustrated by the lack of clear suspects, started to suspect something unthinkable. Could the perpetrator be a woman? At the time, female serial killers were rare in American history. The profile didn't fit. Yet every new discovery made the possibility harder to ignore. One of the biggest breaks in the case came not from the victims themselves, but from their cars. Stolen vehicles began turning up across Florida, abandoned, wrecked, traced back to missing men. And witnesses started reporting a strange sight: a tough-looking blonde woman seen driving cars that didn't belong to her, sometimes alone, sometimes with another woman. Piece by piece, the puzzle was forming, but investigators still didn't have a name. Not yet. Let me stop here and ask you, what do you think investigators were dealing with? On one hand, they had multiple male victims, all linked by highways. On the other, they had vague descriptions of a woman, a drifter, someone nameless, faceless, constantly moving. If you were in their shoes, how would you have tracked her down? And more importantly, at this point in the story, do you see Aileen as someone pushed into self-defense again and again? Or do you see the beginnings of a cold, calculated pattern? As word spread, the press seized on the story. The idea of a woman targeting men along the highways shocked the nation. It broke stereotypes. It terrified communities. The media dubbed her the highway killer. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. Behind every headline was a woman with a broken childhood, a desperate love affair, and a survival instinct sharper than a knife. Yet at the same time, behind every headline was also a grieving family, wondering why their loved one never made it home. By 1990, Aileen Wuornos was no longer just a drifter. She was a subject of one of Florida's largest manhunts. But even then, she remained in plain sight, walking into bars, laughing with Tyria, and blending into the very highways that were swallowing men whole. How long could she keep running? How long before the walls closed in? Because one night, after another abandoned car and another witness sighting, investigators finally got their break. And when they did, the name Aileen Wuornos would become etched into American history forever. By the end of 1990, Florida highways weren't just stretches of asphalt anymore. They were corridors of fear. Each new disappearance added fuel to a growing panic, and whispers spread through truck stops, diners, and small-town motels. The highway killer is still out there, but investigators were closer than anyone realized. And when they finally caught up to Aileen Wuornos, the story of her capture would prove just as twisted, unpredictable, and haunting as the murders themselves. The turning point came with an abandoned car. It belonged to one of the victims. But this time there were witnesses. Two women had been seen trying to push the car out of the mud before leaving it behind. Descriptions poured in. A tough-looking blonde woman, sometimes with another woman by her side. Someone who seemed to live on the fringes, bars, cheap motels, roadside dives. Finally, detectives had more than just bodies. They had a profile, and it was closing in on one name, Aileen Wuornos. But Aileen wasn't easy to pin down. She drifted constantly, living in motels under false names, often disappearing for days at a time. Imagine trying to track a ghost across Florida's endless highways. She could be in Daytona one night, Tampa the next, and back in a Daytona bar by the weekend. The police needed help, and they got it from the one person who knew Aileen better than anyone else. Tyria Moore. Authorities approached Tyria carefully. Did she know what Aileen had been doing? Had she seen evidence? Or was she an innocent partner, caught in the undertow of someone else's storm? Whatever the truth, Tyria was terrified. Terrified of Aileen. Terrified of what might happen if she didn't cooperate. And so, she agreed to help the investigation. Here's where it gets complicated. Tyria would become the key to Aileen's downfall, not by testifying about what she had seen, but by helping investigators secure a confession. Ask yourself, if you were in Tyria's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have protected the person you loved? Or would you have chosen survival, even if it meant betrayal? The plan was risky. Investigators wired Tyria's phone and had her call Aileen, who was hiding out in Florida. On those calls, Tyria begged Aileen to confess, to clear her name, to protect her. Imagine being Aileen in that moment. The one person you trusted, the one person you loved, was suddenly urging you to admit to everything. The calls were recorded. Every word brought investigators closer to the truth. And slowly, Aileen began to crack. Her voice, rough, emotional, filled with frustration, revealed more than she realized. By the time the sting was over, police had enough to make their move. January 9th, 1991. It was a cold day in Florida when undercover officers spotted Aileen at the Last Resort, a biker bar she often visited. She was drinking, laughing, trying to appear as if nothing was wrong. But outside, police were gathering. The net was tightening. And then it was over. Aileen Wuornos, the woman who had haunted Florida highways, was taken into custody. No chase, no shootout, just a quiet end to a violent chapter. But if investigators thought the hardest part was over, they were wrong, because what came next was even more shocking. In the interrogation room, Aileen was defiant. At first, she denied everything. Then she shifted her story, claiming she acted in self-defense, that the men had tried to hurt her and she had no choice. Her words were erratic, emotional, sometimes contradictory. One moment she was swearing she was innocent. The next, she admitted pulling the trigger, but only to save herself. Investigators were left with a chilling question. Was she telling the truth? Or was this just another layer of manipulation from a woman who had lived her life surviving on lies and half-truths? The real breaking point came when Aileen realized Tyria had cooperated with the police. The woman she loved, the woman she trusted above all others, the woman she had lived for, had turned her in. In her own words, Aileen said she confessed because she didn't want Tyria to get dragged down with her. She wanted to protect her. Even as the walls closed in love, twisted, desperate, tragic, was still her motivator. But here's the haunting part. Was that love genuine? Or was it just another survival instinct? One last attempt to cling to the only connection she had left? So what do you think? At this point in the story, is Aileen a victim of betrayal? A broken woman abandoned one last time? Or is she a manipulator, using her confession to control the narrative, to make herself look like the martyr in a relationship built on lies? When you listen to those tapes, you can hear the conflict, the desperation, the defiance. It's almost impossible to separate truth from performance. And maybe that was the point. Maybe even Aileen herself no longer knew the difference. Over the next weeks, Aileen confessed to multiple killings. She gave details about the men, the highways, the encounters, but she always returned to the same claim: self-defense. She painted herself as a hunted, not the hunter, as a woman forced into impossible situations, lashing out to save her own life. But investigators saw it differently. The evidence, the stolen cars, the abandoned belongings, the consistent pattern, told another story, a story of premeditation, not panic. And so, the stage was set. Aileen Wuornos was about to face trial, and the world was about to see her not as a nameless drifter, but as one of the most infamous female killers in U.S. history. In the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters crowded the aisles, and Aileen, wearing a plain prison jumpsuit, stared defiantly back at the world that had finally cornered her. Was she about to tell the truth at last? Or would her trial become another stage for a woman who had lived her entire life as both survivor and deceiver? Stay with me, because in the next act, the verdict would shake America, and the world would never look at hitchhiking the same way again. The courtroom was packed. Cameras lined the aisles. Reporters whispered headlines before the trial even began. And there, at the center of it all, sat Aileen Wuornos, the drifter, the outlaw, the woman the media had already dubbed the highway hunter. But the trial wasn't just about evidence. It wasn't just about 7 men found dead on Florida's highways. It was about something much bigger. Who was Aileen Wuornos really? A cold-blooded predator, or a desperate woman who had been fighting for her life in a world that had never given her a chance? The prosecution painted Aileen as a manipulator, a woman who lured men in, gained their trust, and then turned on them for profit. They pointed to the stolen cars, the pawned belongings, the consistent pattern that repeated with each victim. This, they argued, was no coincidence. This was a calculated series of crimes. But think about it. What does it mean when someone repeats the same pattern again and again? Does it prove intention? Or does it reveal someone trapped in survival mode, unable to escape the life they built for themselves? That question would hang in the air for the entire trial. The defense took a very different approach. They told the jury Aileen wasn't a hunter. She was prey. They claimed she had acted in self-defense, each time forced into situations where her life was at risk. They pointed to her past, her childhood filled with abandonment, her years surviving on the edge of society, her deep mistrust of men. The defense painted a picture of a woman scarred by trauma, cornered into violence by fear. So, audience, let me ask you, do you believe the past can excuse the present? Can a childhood of pain justify choices made in adulthood? Or does every person, no matter their story, eventually have to face accountability? One of the most dramatic moments came when Tyria Moore, Aileen's former partner, took the stand. The courtroom held its breath as Tyria described her relationship with Aileen, the phone calls, the sting operation that led to Eileen's arrest. For Aileen, sitting just feet away, it must have felt like the ultimate betrayal. The one person she had loved was now testifying against her. Can you imagine the tension in that room? A jury trying to separate truth from emotion, love from survival. Was Tyria a victim of manipulation? Or had she finally chosen her own survival over Eileen's loyalty? And then there was Aileen herself. Unlike most defendants, she didn't sit quietly. She lashed out at times, cursed in open court, directed angry words at jurors, lawyers, and reporters. To some, this behavior made her look dangerous, unstable, unremorseful. But to others, it was the raw voice of a woman who had been silenced too long, finally speaking without a filter. So here's the question. Was this the real Aileen Wuornos, a woman in capable control? Or was it performance, a way to shape how the world would remember her? Ultimately, the prosecution had something that the defense couldn't argue away: consistency. The stolen cars, the pawn shop slips with Eileen's fingerprints, the eyewitnesses who placed her near abandoned vehicles, the taped confessions where she admitted to pulling the trigger. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. But even then, the case was complicated, because while the evidence showed she had killed, it didn't fully answer the why. Was it profit? Was it rage? Or was it, as Aileen claimed, always self-defense? The jury faced an impossible task. On one hand, they were told to view her as a predator, someone who had deliberately ended lives for gain. On the other, they were asked to see her as a survivor, a woman fighting back in situations where she felt trapped and endangered. If you had been on that jury, which story would you have believed? Would you have seen Aileen Wuornos as a monster or as a product of a world that had chewed her up from the start? After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The room was silent. Reporters clutched their pens. Viewers at home leaned forward toward their televisions. Guilty. Not once, not twice, but in case after case, Aileen Wuornos was found guilty of murder. And with those words, her fate was sealed. The first woman in U.S. history to fit the profile of the so-called female serial highway killer was now condemned by a jury of her peers. But here's where the story takes yet another twist. Aileen didn't beg for mercy. She didn't cry. She didn't even plead her case. Instead, she stared back at the world with defiance. She told the court she didn't want sympathy. She didn't want excuses. She wanted the process to be over. Her words echoed like a chilling confession, not of guilt, but of exhaustion, as if she had been fighting her entire life. And this, at last, was the end of the battle. So, let me ask you, what do you make of that? Do you hear defiance? Or do you hear resignation? Was Aileen embracing her role as villain? Or was she simply too tired to fight anymore? Because in those moments, it almost felt as if she wanted the verdict. As if punishment was the only closure she could imagine for a life filled with betrayal, pain, and violence. In the end, the court handed down the ultimate sentence. For Aileen Wuornos, the highways that had once given her freedom would now be replaced with the cold walls of death row, and the world was left with a haunting paradox. Was justice served, or had society simply discarded a woman it never cared to save in the first place? But the story doesn't end here, because even behind bars, Aileen Wuornos refused to stay silent. Her interviews, her outbursts, her final statements would continue to shock the world, leaving behind one of the most controversial legacies in American criminal history. In the next act, we'll step into her years on death row and into the mind of a woman who was never afraid to face the world, even when it turned against her.
Breaking news coverage continues on the Aileen Wuornos case.
We're bringing you live updates from the courthouse.
When the gavel struck and the sentence was read, Aileen Wuornos' fate was sealed. Death row. But if you think that meant silence, you'd be mistaken. Because Aileen wasn't finished speaking. In fact, some of her most haunting words, her most infamous moments, came not on the highways of Florida, not in the courtroom, but from behind the steel bars of prison. What happens when someone with nothing left to lose decides to make the whole world listen? Tonight, we step into the final chapter of Aileen Wuornos' life, a chapter filled with defiance, paranoia, confessions, contradictions, and one last twist. Florida's death row is not a place of comfort. The days are long, the nights are longer, and the silence is broken only by the echo of doors clanging shut. For Aileen, those walls became her home for more than a decade. Alone in her cell, she had endless time to reflect on her choices, or to refuse reflection entirely. But unlike many inmates who fade into obscurity, Aileen became something else, a spectacle. Documentaries, interviews, and journalists all wanted to hear her story. And every time she opened her mouth, the world listened. But the question remained, was she telling the truth or performing one last act for cameras? From the start, her words shifted like quicksand. One day, she claimed self-defense, insisting every man she killed had threatened her, and she acted only to survive. The next day, she admitted flatly, yes, she killed, and she did it deliberately. Which version was real? To some, these contradictions were proof of instability. To others, they were a calculated attempt to control her legacy, to decide how she would be remembered. So I ask you, when someone changes their story again and again, do we dismiss them as unreliable, or do we recognize that even contradictions can reveal hidden truths? As her name spread, Aileen became a figure larger than life. She wasn't just a convicted killer anymore. She was a subject of films, books, and endless debate. Some portrayed her as a monster, others as a broken woman molded by trauma. And Aileen, she seemed to enjoy that spotlight. She gave interviews where she smiled, joked, and then, in the next breath, raged at the world with fiery words that stunned even seasoned reporters. It was unpredictable, it was chilling, and it was unforgettable. The longer Aileen sat on death row, the more her mental state appeared to unravel. She ranted about conspiracies, about being watched, about forces beyond her control. She accused prison staff of torment. At times, her words spilled out like a storm, unfiltered and impossible to follow. But here's the twist. Amid the chaos, there were moments of eerie clarity. Moments where she spoke calmly, logically, even eloquently about her life, her regrets, and her view of justice. It left people wondering, was she unraveling or was she performing? Was this madness or manipulation? Let me ask you directly. If you were sitting across from Aileen Wuornos, hearing her say one moment, I killed to survive, and the next, I killed because I wanted to, what would you believe? Would you see a woman losing her grip on reality? Or would you see someone who understood the power of narrative, carefully shaping her own myth even from inside a cell? As the years passed, appeals were filed and denied. Lawyers fought to overturn the sentence, arguing mental illness, unstable upbringing, and flawed investigations. But Aileen herself grew tired of waiting. She shocked her attorneys by asking to drop all appeals. She didn't want more time. She didn't want another chance. I want it done, she said. Can you imagine that? Most people on death row cling desperately to every possible delay. But Aileen, she wanted the end to come sooner. What does that tell you about her mindset? Resignation? Exhaustion? Or one last act of defiance? Controlling even the manner of her death? By October 2002, the end was set. In her last days, Aileen gave one final round of interviews. And true to form, her words were as unsettling as ever. She accused her jailers of conspiring against her. She claimed she was being watched, manipulated, and targeted by forces beyond anyone's understanding. But then, without warning, she shifted again, smiling, laughing, joking with reporters. Was this fear disguised as bravado? Or was it a mask she had worn her whole life, right up to the very end? On the morning of October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was led into the execution chamber. She was calm, almost unnervingly calm. In her final words, she made strange, cryptic statements, talking about returning to Earth, about journeys beyond this world, about destiny. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It wasn't an apology. It was something else entirely, a message that left many shaking their heads, wondering if Aileen Wuornos had just spoken her last truth or her last performance. And just like that, it was over. But in many ways, Aileen's story has never ended. Her life has been retold in documentaries, in dramas, in endless debates online. To some, she remains a monster, Proof that evil doesn't always look the way we expect. To others, she's a tragic figure, a woman shaped by abandonment, trauma, and betrayal, who lashed out in ways the world could never forgive. And maybe that's why her story lingers, because it forces us to ask, was she born this way, destined to kill? Or did society itself create her? So now I turn to you. What do you think? When you look back at the life of Aileen Wuornos, from a child abandoned in Michigan, to a drifter on Florida's highways, to a woman whose name still haunts true crime history, do you see a predator? Or do you see a product of her past, a woman consumed by the same darkness that once consumed her? And more importantly, what does it say about us that even now, decades later, we're still asking these questions? Because maybe the real story of Aileen Wuornos isn't just about the lives she took. Maybe it's about the world that failed to protect her before she ever had the chance to protect herself. And that question, who failed who, is one that will echo long after the highways of Florida have gone quiet. If you found Aileen's story as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Untold Crime for more haunting true crime stories that uncover the darkness behind the headlines. And if this case sent shivers down your spine, don't stop here. Our next story might just be even more unsettling.